Anthony Albanese's Qantas saga has prompted calls for a crackdown on the rules governing the conduct of politicians. But has the damage already been done in the eyes of voters ahead of the looming federal election? For more on this, I'm joined by Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Hi there, Simon. Welcome to the show. So you think the damage is already done, even though we have such short attention spans in this day and age?
Yeah, thanks, Leigh. Yeah. Usually an issue like this, we actually wouldn't expect too much to come of it. You know, the story of politicians and perks is a story as old as time. And usually it sort of just washes through. What's happened with this issue, though, is even prior to this story breaking, there had been this sort of growing disquiet, particularly among sort of working class, really economically precarious voters, that perhaps Anthony Albanese wasn't quite what he was making himself out to be. So, you know, they were very conscious of that sort of origin story of Anthony Albanese, a kid that grew up in public housing and, you know, made it to the highest office. That story kind of resonated. And what's been happening over the last sort of year and a half has been this sort of idea of, well, if that's his background, he should really understand the distresses that we're under with, you know, cost of living, housing crisis, and these sorts of things. Why isn't he doing more? So these voters particularly have been asking themselves that question. And the sort of the disquiet and the sort of the conclusion that they're been working towards is that, well, maybe he doesn't get it anymore. Maybe he doesn't really care as much about, you know, the communities that he's sort of purportedly come from, to be able to do more on cost of living, to be able to do more on housing. And so this story has kind of attached itself to this growing disquiet. So it's become of sort of greater significance than just a normal sort of politician's perk story. It's become a sort of story about who Anthony Albanese is in the eyes of, as I say, these particular voters, working class, economically precarious, but who are going to be extremely important in those outer suburban contests that we know the Libs are going after.
If this reinforces their fears that Albanese is a sellout, you know, what will it take to win back their trust? And how do they feel about the coalition?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to take the second part of your question first. Is it's not necessarily translating directly into a vote to the Liberals. We are seeing sort of, you know, vote intention, particularly in those communities, is really swirling around at the moment. It's landing on sorts of unusual places. How that solidifies coming into the election is a very important question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. As I say, it's a sort of a work in progress. Certainly, those communities don't hold the kind of aversion to voting for Peter Dutton that you see, for example, say in a Teal seat or some of those other seats where they perceive a sort of values disconnect. So there's certainly opportunity there for the Libs, but at the moment it's a bit fluid. What Labor needs to do to reconnect, these voters are incredibly pragmatic, and you know, a strong economic pitch to these voters will be important. I mean, Labor's talked about extending the free TAFE program. That's a good start, but it's really only a start. So they'll be looking for, you know, strong action on cost of living, strong action on housing. They are historic Labor voters, so I'd hesitate to say easy to win them back, but it's certainly easier to win them back than it is to convert sort of historic Liberal voters to your pile. But it's going to take a sort of a really brave economic sort of program to speak to these voters, and also sort of the service deprivation that these communities have suffered from. You know, they're well aware that their health services and public transport services are diminished. So I think sort of infrastructure, services, economic, they are very pragmatic voters, and they can be won back because they've got that sort of historical affiliation with Labor.
We talk a lot about how you know, demographic changes can affect election results in the US. What about in Australia, especially with the outer suburbs and the regions? Are there lessons for Australian elections as well?
I think the big thing about the outer suburbs and even the regions to an extent in terms of demographic change is the incredible diversity now that we have in those communities. You know, this is not Australia of the 1990s anymore. And that is a bit of a barrier for Peter Dutton. We do know that amongst diverse Australians that the Liberals do not do as well as Labor does. And so I think, if there's going to be a saving grace for Labor in those outer suburban seats, it could well be sort of the diverse communities that are out there. Because, at the moment, they're sort of, they're struggling, as we talked about, they're struggling to convince voters in the whole out there that, they're on their side and that they've got their interests in mind. So, I think the diversity story will be important in this next election.
Thanks so much for your time. Great talking to you. Simon Welsh,
Thanks.
Redbridge Group Director.